of Mapping the Pandemic, our weekly look at how the current health crisis is going to impact on our world. This week, we're looking at Britain's relations with China after the pandemic is over. And it's worth remembering the words of Dominic Raab, Britain's Foreign Secretary, who about a week ago said that we need to look again at the entire gamut of our relations with China, and that, quote, there is no doubt that we can't have business as usual. So we are joined now by a team of very great experts here in the studio, by Verly Nalvens, our research fellow in here at the Institute, by Raffaello Pantucci, our senior associate fellow, who is at the moment based in Singapore, and by Professor Steve Tsang, the director of the SOAS China Institute here in London. Let me turn first to my colleague Verly to kick off the presentation, but I should tell all our audience that you have the Q&A function on this app, on the Zoom app, so please keep the questions coming in, and I will try to get as many of your questions as I possibly can. First, Verly.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I will start off by talking a little bit about the current domestic situation in China that really drives a lot of its external activities and perception and engagement with other states. So I think this is an important discussion to have. Firstly, in terms of the COVID situation in China, we see a stabilization really internally. So there are very few low numbers. Most of these numbers are indeed imported numbers, so not necessarily locally transmitted cases. However, having said this, there is, of course, a perception, I think, and this has been noted by Xi Jinping himself, that the external environment isn't necessarily changing. There are still clusters of breakouts and epidemics in different countries. And so the overseas spread continues, and China is therefore not necessarily completely out of the woods yet. So this is a preparation to say that internally, China is doing well. There is still a risk of further cases, but it is being managed. That trust deficit that we saw earlier around how the Chinese government handled the COVID crisis is also, I think, being slightly narrowed or attempted to be narrowed through the fact that China has revised at least the Wuhan death cases, saying that actually numbers were higher than they initially were thought to be, and that this was due to an insufficient capability to admit and also treat cases of COVID. So there's an attempt really here to kind of to repair the image a little bit internally. And to also prepare the Chinese population for what might come ahead. We can still, of course, debate the numbers and whether we think those are accurate or not, but that is, I think, currently at least the domestic political objective. Now, in terms of the economic situation in China, there are also no illusions here. I think the fact that Xi Jinping already in late April said that meeting previously set targets, economic targets for China was going to be difficult is an indication that China is aware that meeting the 2021 centenary goals, which is to create a moderately prosperous society based on GDP terms, for one, and eradication of unemployment in the country, or sorry, not unemployment, poverty eradication in the country will be difficult to meet this year in the run-up to the 2021 100-year anniversary of the CCP. And that is, of course, a very key date. So what he did also say, though, is that nobody can be relaxed in the situation. Everybody must do what they can to still push ahead and try and attain these economic growth goals as best as they can. Now, to put this into perspective, this will be very difficult because earlier it had been noted by some observers that this would necessitate a 5.5% growth rate in 2020. The World Bank has said that China will probably grow at a rate of 2.3% of the GDP. And by comparison, in 2019, this was 6% growth of the in GDP. So it's really taking a hit economically. So the question is, how does China come out of this? How does it get its economy going again? We have the two sessions meeting, a very important government meeting coming up on the 22nd of May, later this month, where we will hear what the GDP growth target for this year will be. That will be a great indication as to how far the government thinks it can get the economy back on track. Additionally, it'll also set key targets for things like unemployment, fiscal deficit, and consumption. So really a key meeting to keep an eye on. They will also likely announce what stimulus package they have put together for the country. But here it's very interesting because we see discussions around new infrastructure. And for this, we need to think of things like 5G. There's also a focus on shoring up consumption and driving this up to really drive the economy forwards. But unemployment is currently up. There are discussions around what the official figures are, around 23 million, I believe, and what the unofficial figures likely are, probably around 50 million. And so when you look at relying on consumption domestically, what you would need is consumer confidence. And that consumer confidence is not there because people are losing their jobs. People do not have enough faith in the healthcare system and the social benefit system. And so this is going to be a difficulty moving forwards for China to try and address this. Does it focus on investing in SOEs, or does it focus on investing in SMEs, which largely drive the economy? So we'll see what they have to, what they will announce. But in any case, the government will likely say that its handling of COVID was a great success, and that the country, by and large, despite the difficulties, is intact and doing better than it probably sought. Now, externally, there has been, I think, recently a report that has come into the news about a hardening external environment for China. Economically, of course, this includes the fact that countries are looking inwards. So that doesn't necessarily help China when it's trying to grow its economy. And a lot of its economy is based on at least exporting goods. Secondly, there's a call for supply chains to move them out of China. Again, not great for driving up the economy. And then finally, there are discussions around whether China should engage in debt forgiveness for the BRI. And when it comes to this, this will again be more of a burden on any form of economic rebound for the PRC. So how it does this, how it engages in some of these good faith measures, while also focusing primarily on its domestic economy, will be tricky. But of course, there's also a political hardening externally. We see an acceleration on the debate around the PRC, trustworthiness of China, whether engagement is still an option, whether there should be an inquiry into COVID, which is being particularly pushed hard by the United States and some other allies, and whether countries should be engaging in a new China policy. And of course, there have been calls for this within the UK. So this is a new, this situation of political hardening, I think, is gaining slight momentum, which for China at this particular time is not entirely convenient. Now, China's response has, of course, also been quite hardened. We see a engagement of wolf warrior diplomacy, which is an aggressive and assertive style of public relations and diplomacy with countries. There are, of course, differences in how China has approached some countries, but overall, the tone has been quite harsh, and in some cases, there's been, a use of turning the debate towards some conspiracy theories or towards deflecting blame from China, and to a certain extent, also threatening economic consequences if, for example, countries engaged with an inquiry into the origin of COVID, which would necessitate access to China. This is, by all measures, not helpful. But it does, I think, reflect that internally there is a need to drive up nationalism in order to support the CCP and to support China. But I think we must also not forget that internally in China, there are some citizens who are likely wondering why, when many countries are doing a not so stellar job at containing the virus internally in their own countries, China is being particularly singled out. So I think we need to remember that as well. Finally, when it comes to China's response, there are also voices of calm. Now, I think the ambassador, the Chinese ambassador to the United States has been a particular voice of calm. He's called for an end to the blame game, for China and the United States to work together. And he's also refuted the conspiracy theory, for example, that the United States brought the virus to China. But ultimately, I think for now, we can't expect that these voices will be the mainstream. I think we'll continue to see an engagement of wolf warrior diplomacy, if we want to call it that, simply because domestic priorities trump foreign policy priorities at the moment. In addition to this, there's also, of course, been a focus that China has been engaging in disinformation campaigns, whether through public diplomacy statements coming out of the MFA or through embassies, which really try to change the narrative, promote different theories around where the virus came from, deflect from China's situation and how it handled the virus early on in the outbreak, and to, above all, stress international cooperation. So international cooperation is really where they want to focus on, to try and forget the ugliness that has happened and move forwards. This will be pertinent to the United Kingdom. However, at the same time, of course, there's difficulties in, for example, if China focuses its economic recovery on shoring up domestic consumption and domestic companies, what does that mean for the trade relationship with the UK and China? Second of all, when China is now, we've seen some quite harsh words come out over Hong Kong, what does that mean for the bilateral relationship between the UK and China moving forwards? And of course, the military posturing that we're seeing by China as well, which China says, you know, the PLA has not been affected by COVID and remains mission ready. Again, a message for domestic consumption. I think that likewise, when it comes to partnerships in the region who are worried about Chinese engagement, military engagement in the region, this will also have an impact on the UK's approach to China. So lots of questions there, which I will leave to my other two fellow panelists to follow up on. Thank you, Jonathan.
Pele, thank you so much for that. Now let us turn to our colleague in Singapore, slightly closer to the action, for his remarks. Raffaello?
Thank you, Jonathan, and hello, colleagues. So I was asked to touch a little bit on the UK relationship specifically, so I'll talk a little bit about that, though I might react a little bit to some of Vela's comments as well, and I see lots of questions that started pouring in. But first, thank you for the invitation to come here today. I will try to keep my comments brief so we can get straight to the discussion, which is always the most invigorating part, even when done down the computer like this. So I think for the UK, the China policy, there has for really quite a long time been something of an absence of a China policy within the United Kingdom. What you had under the sort of Cameron-Osborne years was you had a particular leader, minister, who had a particular opinion on China that he pushed forwards. And because no one else had really thought about this in any sort of strategic way, that meant it got very much driven forwards by that single institution. An engagement, I would argue back then, was founded on the idea that, you know, China was a reality and Asia was the future. And that, you know, the more we engage with China, the more we would be able to sort of change it and shape it into the norms and practices that we would like. So, you know, the more you engage with this institution, the more it becomes like you and therefore, you know, transforms. It's not, of course, clear that that really worked as a policy. But what we saw happening was as a new government came in, the new government came in under Prime Minister May, and it didn't particularly express a very clear perspective on China. What we saw happen instead was China policy essentially get devolved to different ministries. And so every single ministry within British government would have its own approach towards China. And because at this time, we're now talking at a moment when China is the big story on the international stage, that means it ends up cutting into everybody's business. So every single department within the sort of British government has its own approach to China, but its own approach to China is forged on what its particular interests and goals are. So if you're a trade ministry, you're focused on trading. If you're a development ministry, you're focused on development. If you're a military ministry, you're focused on military. So each institution has its own particular interests and focuses. And this means you have a policy that races off in lots of different directions without having your sort of clear strategic course sitting at its center. And this had not only the impact of creating a sort of very confused policy in London about what exactly it was we were planning to do or thinking about with China, it also really confused the rest of the world. For a lot of our sort of partners, Asian partners in particular around the world, it started to look a lot like, for the United Kingdom, there really wasn't a kind of Asia policy, there was a China policy. And that China policy was shaped by the different institutions, but you didn't have a kind of coherent vision for what it was that China wanted, how it was the United Kingdom wanted to sort of engage with China going forward. And then the final point I'd add about this was all taking place at a moment when, quite frankly, China was an irrelevance in the British political conversation. I remember being able to open the newspapers and never find a story about China in any of them. You would find something sort of buried somewhere in the back pages, some random story where something funny happened in Wuhan province or Xinjiang or whatever. It was never really a big story. Now, of course, that has completely changed. Now, China is the central topic of conversation with not only our main strategic partner on the international stage, the United States, but also within the United Kingdom around the issue of course, the virus, which emanated from China ultimately. But I think what's important to remember about all of this is that notwithstanding the sort of pendulum shifting so dramatically in the other direction, the underlying issues that existed between the UK's relationship with China have not really gone away. And those come into the very simple fact that it is a very complicated issue to try to engage with the world's second largest economy, which on the one hand, you have many fundamental disagreements with on human rights issues, on questions around the treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, on the treatment of Hong Kong, on the treatment of Taiwan, on the continued incarceration of 2 Canadian researchers who've been held now for more than 500 days on charges that have never been entirely made clear. And of course, the pendulum has completely shifted with our major strategic ally on the international stage, the United States. So these are all the problems that do exist, and they are really big and difficult problems for the United Kingdom to have to tackle. But at the same time, there is that realization that to deal with some of the biggest issues that the world has to face on the international stage at the moment, be it restarting the global economy after we get through this COVID lock-in nightmare, be it climate change, be it managing the next pandemic that might be coming down the line, or restarting the global economy. These are all issues where some sort of engagement with China will be necessary. And this is a dilemma that everyone in the world is facing. No one really wants to see a world that is bifurcated. No one really wants to see a world where we've got sort of 2 parallel existences happening, a kind of US sphere of influence and then a Chinese sphere of influence. But everybody wants to find a way of somehow threading the needle and moving somewhere between the 2. No one, by the way, really wants collapse on either side either. I mean, the last thing we really want is to have a sort of total state collapse or a total regime change, arguably, in either particular country. The sort of consequences of that would be, hugely damaging for the world. These are the world's 2 largest economies. This isn't, the sort of Soviet Union back in the day, which was, a declining economy that really wasn't anywhere near the sort of size and shape of what we're seeing in China today. So the consequences of that would be really catastrophic to us all. And so the key, and this is in some ways what I think UK policy is increasingly leaning towards, and I think a lot of countries around the world are leaning towards, is trying to find a way of avoiding making that choice and not being forced by either side to have to make that choice or to have to choose sides. And this is, I think, where the UK really needs to focus, is where is the UK national interest in each and every issue? And how is it that the UK is going to advance its own personal national interest within it? There is a narrative that says that actually this is impossible to do. We have to make a choice of one side or the other. I'm not entirely sure that's true. India, a country that everyone touts as, the great sort of alternative to China. And everyone says, well, the Indians will get on side. Once they're on side, we have the great Asian democracy on side. Then, suddenly, this will be the counter in some way to China. I mean, India's been hedging its relationship with China for years. We may look at Modi and say, this is a man who's got a very robust view of the world, a very aggressive policy towards his communities at home, towards Pakistan, towards China. But this is also a man who's met President Xi Jinping a number of times and talked about how important their strategic relationship is. and also how important China's relationship economically is to India. So I think we're being presented a situation where there is a set of choices that have to be made. And I would argue that we have to focus on where our national interest lies, focus narrowly on those interests and push forwards against whichever side is forcing us to choose to make sure that those interests are advanced rather than getting dragged into one side or the other. I think I've left my time at that, so I'll pass it back to Jonathan or straight over to Steve. Thank you all very much.
Raffaello, thank you so much. Thank you for that. Thank you for reminding us how complex the issue is, and also that it's not necessarily a binary choice that has to be made of one or the other. Let us now turn to Professor Zhang for his comments before we open up. And I should remind you, please keep the questions coming in. I think I've got over 16, 17 questions now and counting. Steve?
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. Just to pick up from, in a sense, where Raab has left off, I think when we look at UK-China relations and the behavior of China, we have to make some clear distinctions. We have to make a distinction between the British perception of how China as a country or the Chinese government, and here when we talk about China, we really are talking about how the Communist Party is behaving. Does not have a way of behaving with us. It is the Communist Party which controls Chinese government that behaves in the way it does. When we look at that, we have to make the distinction between how we see that and how they actually behave. And I don't think they are completely equivalent. Our perception of how the Chinese government has been behaving has changed, and it is still changing. But I'll put it to you that the way how the Chinese government is behaving to form. They haven't really changed in a fundamental way. They may have behaved in a more extreme form, in a more blatant form, but this is what they are. That is how they normally think about relationship with the rest of the world, UK included. When we look at foreign policy, we think about national interest. When the Communist Party think about foreign policy, at the core of national interest is the interest of the Communist Party, and which ultimately means keeping the party in power and making sure that the authority of Xi Jinping is not and cannot be challenged in any way. Now, COVID-19 is a very big deal in China. At the moment, we can see that China is doing actually very well in comparison to us, Europe, or the United States. They are doing very, very well indeed. But if you go back by 6 weeks or 2 months, the story is very, very different. If you are looking at the end of January and practically most of February, China was in crisis. It was a time when Xi Jinping did not take the lead publicly to lead the fight against COVID-19. It was a time when he put Premier Li Keqiang in charge. The last time he did that was the 2015 Shanghai stock market meltdown, when he wasn't even sure that China would be able to cope with it. It was the same thing. And so for all that we talk about Chinese foreign policy and how it's changed, all those changes happened because of domestic political considerations, because the party felt insecure, and therefore the party has to control very tightly the narrative. And because there was so much anger within China towards the Communist Party for the early failings, the party had to find an opportunity to change that narrative. So when Italy became, in relative terms, worse than China, the narrative was being shifted. Focus was shifted to Italy to highlight how, in comparison, China is doing better. And when the United States was catching up fast behind Italy, then America became the target. We see that. And that's why we have all these, to people who are outside of China, completely ludicrous idea that the virus started with the United States Army or with the Italians because they were supposed to have it even before China had it. But that kind of things generated huge amount of pushbacks from us, because finally, British media, British politicians and opinion leaders begin to say, there's something wrong about this. We have treated China like a good, reliable partner. And we expect a good, reliable partner to respond in a certain way. It isn't responding in the way that we were expecting. And I think that drives that change in how we look at the relationship with China and how we try to engage with China. But when we look at that and then assume, because there are senior people in the UK who are now speaking in a skeptical way about relationship with China and talking about maybe we need to have a complete overhaul of our relationship with China, including senior Tory party members, we then assume that there is probably going to be a major policy change at the end of COVID-19. Now there, I will again add a note of caution. A policy review at the end of COVID-19 over relationship with China, I think is almost a certainty. So much water has come down to has happened. I think it's very, very difficult for the government not to think about some kind of a policy. But then in the post-COVID world, when our economy will be in such a dire strait, and most of our key partners will also be in pretty poor economic situations, is that the times that the government in London will want to put the relationship with China at risk, knowing full well that whatever we do, as long as we are not doing something that the Chinese government completely approves of, is likely to result in some kind of retaliation from the Chinese side. Will we do that? Will we not do that? I don't think that is a foregone conclusion. I think we have to be realistic in terms of understanding that, yes, the Chinese government may have been behaving very badly. We may be finally beginning to see how they behave as a player in the international community is, but are we feeling comfortable and confident enough to make that change? Now, looking forward a little bit, I think we will have to expect that we will see even more actions on the part of the Chinese government that will make us very uncomfortable. I think Hong Kong is going to be one in the next 6 to 12 months. I would expect that the Chinese government will be pushing much harder in Hong Kong in terms of cracking down against the protest that is at the moment not yet there. But they remember what happened last summer. They don't want to let that happen again. It is a perfect time for them to push very hard, because the UK, the EU, and the United States, the main countries that are likely to be raising issues about Hong Kong, are kind of on our knees and dependent on China for critical supplies like PPEs. If it is not a good time for them to push a hard line in Hong Kong, I don't know what will be. Now, I have no inside information that the Chinese government is saying that they will do so, but in the way how they normally behave and conduct themselves and see their interests, I think that is something which we will have to expect to happen. Likewise, I think we can expect them to be pushing pretty hard, perhaps over the South China Sea, perhaps by the setting up of an ADIZ, Air Defense Identification Zone, something that they have wanted to do for a number of years, but have somehow held back a little bit. But moving forward, it is something that they may well do. Likewise, they may also be pushing even harder for companies like Huawei. And if that is the case, I think that in itself speaks volume about the relationship between Huawei and the Chinese government. Alibaba does not get spoken up by the Chinese government the same way that Huawei does. And arguably, Alibaba is a much more dynamic Chinese company than Huawei or any other, really. And why would that be the case? I think you can draw your own conclusion of that. I think my time is up, so over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you to all the three panelists for the very spirited discussions. I think we at least covered the magnitude of the problem and the challenges facing us, and I'm grateful to Steve for reminding us that we're also in the throes of negotiating our future trade deals after leaving the European Union, in which China will figure prominently. Let's move directly to the questions. We've got quite a number of them, some of them submitted before it began. I think the first one I will choose is from Yubing Kang from China Central Television, CCTV. Also a question that she is joined by another question from Ekaterina Dimitrova, one of our members, both questions on the same line, which is, there's a lot of heated debate. There's a lot of heated arguments in the media, rarely referred to the need to calm down some of the temperature. But nevertheless, there is an anger in the public and there's an anger in the coverage in the media. Are we facing a new Cold War? Is there a possibility that we will descend into a new Cold War? Raf, I think I'll start with you if you have a few words to say, and then I'll turn to the other participants.
Sure, thank you, Jonathan. I mean, you know, clearly that's where the rhetoric is pushing us, and everyone's talking about a new Cold War as though it's some sort of reality. I mean, the point I would make is that we're in a very different context to the Cold War. The relationship that China has with the world is not the relationship that the Soviet Union had with the world. So I'm not sure the comparison really works. And I'm not entirely sure what it is that people are saying is that, what are we saying? We're going into a situation where we're going to freeze relations between our two sides in some way. I'm not sure I see us going in that direction. I think certainly there is a growing amount of anger in the public discourse. I think a lot of that has been stirred up by political actors on all sides, quite frankly, for their own domestic political reasons. In China, it's to advance nationalism, as I think Virla was suggesting in her comments. I think Steve touched upon as well. You know, nationalism is a very good card to play to make sure everyone's on your side. And I think in the West, frankly, politicians are doing the same thing. In the United States, we can see politics being played to sort of ensure an election. And we can see in, frankly, other countries, people are jumping onto the bandwagon. In Europe, different powers are sort of choosing sides, really on the basis of the fact that it's a way for them to have a go at their enemies at home. So, you know, I think that the rhetoric and the action don't necessarily always match up with each other. So I don't know that we're in a new Cold War situation. And I think we are in danger, however, of talking ourselves into what we think is one.
Thank you for that. There'll be, unsurprisingly, a number of other questions on exactly the same lines. Steve?
Shocking.
Jonathan, I think I would agree with Jonathan, with Ralph, that we are not looking at a new Cold War, but we are looking at decoupling becoming real. I think when Donald Trump talked about decoupling last year, most people and companies in Europe didn't really want to respond to that. I think we kind of found that a bit silly. But COVID-19 and the disruption of the supply chain and the reality that China in the end turns out to be less than a reliable partner in providing critical supplies in a moment of crisis may well change a lot of that at a practical working level. That there will be some shifting of the production of critical supplies from China to more reliable locations, not necessarily reshoring, but I think that is going to happen. And some of the multinationals which are using China as a manufacturing base, but not simply to supply the China market, may also be looking at reshoring some of their manufacturing facilities. And let's also not forget that decoupling might have been something that Donald Trump brought to our attention, but it didn't start with Donald Trump. It started with Xi Jinping when he issued document number 9 in 2013 by which he prescribed specific Western ideas and concepts like democracy, like civil society. And we are now actually moving in the direction that they want Chinese scientists to move away from the science citation index to something that is indigenous Chinese. So even in sciences, they are looking at some kind of separation from us.
So not necessarily a Cold War, but a decoupling of sorts could well be on the cards. I don't think necessarily, as you said, this is in contradiction to what Raab was saying. Vale?
Yeah, likewise. I mean, I agree. I don't think we are in a Cold War, but I do think that by using, as Raab said, by using the rhetoric of Cold War language, then we almost create a self-fulfilling prophecy to a certain extent. And I think that is something that we should try and avoid. So, you know, there is, of course, a necessity to be critical when being critical is necessary, to question certain assumptions. But I do think that if we continue this language, that we are in a Cold War, that it is an us versus them situation, that it's either you're with us or you're against us, then you do start to push countries into a situation where they at least feel like they're forced to choose. And on top of that, there's additional language around a competition of systems that are based on very different values and that cannot coexist. So in that sense, I do think that there, while we are not in the same situation as the previous Cold War, we are certainly using language that is inching us closer towards that sort of competition.
Thank you. Let me, since the US Congress has just been presented with a new set of potential restrictions on the transfer of technology to China, and they're being discussed as we speak, let's examine for a second this question of decoupling and what do the panelists think, how far the decoupling can work. So we've got a number of questions, one from Ashley Hoyle and one from Michael McClay, a policy consultant with a long experience, both more or less asking the same. Is this decoupling realistic in technological and trade terms? And is China, from your perception, worried about this? Is it something that actually seriously worries the Chinese, or do they think that it's a bit more of a noise coming up from the West? I think I'll start perhaps with Steve this time.
Right. The Chinese are both worried about it and not quite as worried about it. I think it depends on the level you are looking at in the Chinese establishment. At the professional working level, I think they really don't want to see this happen. At the top level, I think Xi Jinping is kind of slightly mixed. I don't think he wants to see decoupling so fast, being set at a pace outside of China. He would like to see it happen at his pace. So you are going to see a kind of mixed feelings in terms of how the Chinese look at it. Now, how far is it going to be realistic? I think we're going to be looking at very different kinds of decoupling by different players. For some kind of manufacturing, I think they can probably reshore. If you're looking at European companies, and if the EU comes out of COVID-19 well, which of course is a big if, but if it should do so, I would expect that there may be more exploration of southern or perhaps eastern part of Europe as locations for the manufacturing of some of the products being manufactured in China at the moment. But there are also a lot of multinationals which are now selling more in China than in the domestic market. For example, General Motors. China is a more important market for General Motors than most certainly Europe, or for that matter, even the United States. And there's no way a company like General Motors will want to take part of that in that decoupling process. So I think we're going to see a very uneven process happening. but we may be also seeing potentially some governments providing some kind of support to enable some companies to do so. But that would depend on individual cases of which country sees which industry as of strategic value to that government itself.
Rafa, would you like to come back on this one?
I mean, I'll just add very briefly, I think that unfortunately decoupling is realistic. And I think that, you know, the lesson that I think China's drawn from the years before COVID-19 is that if you look at how the US was, you know, someone put this analogy to me in a way that I thought worked very well. They said, there's all the strands that connect the US and China. And what you've seen over the past few years, the US has gradually been cutting all of them. And China's seen this happen. And so I remember last year, on the last opportunities I had to go to China, talking to people who were working at the companies who were basically talking about decoupling as a reality, as kind of a fait accompli thing that was happening. And therefore they were going to have to operate around it. And I think that when it ultimately happens, you'll see a shock, and odd companies will get hit in odd ways, surprising ways. A company like Huawei, which is incredibly reliant on US supply chains for some of its microprocessors, will suddenly have to figure out how it's going to reshore all of that. Similarly, as Steve points out, there's foreign companies that are hugely reliant on China, and suddenly they have to figure that out. I think the question will be how many of these companies will be willing to accept operating under a kind of double standard system to make sure that they can stay in both camps, and how many of them will frankly go under or decide to focus on one or the other. I think the net loss will be to humanity, because of course cooperation does make, I think, better for in lots of different directions. But I think the indicators are we're going in the direction of decoupling. And I think you can see people making quite active choices in that direction already. I think China is worried about it, but I think China assumes that it's going to be able to insulate itself against it by the fact that it has, you know, 1.4 billion size population that it can rely on as its consumer base for whatever ultimately needs to get produced. Thank you.
Vali?
Yeah, I mean, I think that point of standards is really important. I think that if you are going to look at decoupling, then you are also looking at different vying standards on the international market. And I don't think that China is only going to rely, of course, on its domestic market, no matter how important that is. It can't only rely on its own domestic population for consumption. So I think the question ultimately is decoupling in what, as Steve said, in what sector, for what products. For some, there is going to be continued interest in investing in China, obviously. I mean, the example of General Motors is one. But I think secondly, of course, some of these supply chains are so incredibly intricate that really further down the supply chain, there is still a Chinese element there. So if you're thinking about decoupling, what do you mean by decoupling? Does that mean just not investing in China in big terms? Does it mean not including Chinese elements in certain products? I mean, that's a very, very complicated picture. And beyond this, I think I do think that the Chinese government is concerned about a rapid decoupling. I agree with that statement. But I would also say that China itself was looking to invest in cheaper markets for manufacturing goods, for example. So it was, to a certain extent, preparing for this, but it also had its own interests in looking at markets elsewhere for its own manufacturing supply chains.
And of course, one of the ironies of decoupling is that the ones who will be hit first would be some of America's allies in Asia, like Taiwan. For instance, all the semiconductor business, where the Taiwanese supply in equal amounts both to the Americans and to the Chinese, and are now caught in the middle with any kind of decoupling choice. Since we are on the subject of decoupling, let me turn perhaps to the question that perhaps everyone was expecting in this session, the famous Huawei debate. Robert Fox from the Evening Standard is asking, well, how is Britain going to react to all the push and pull factors now in Washington, to people saying that Britain should be sort of disconnected from the F-35 project, or that American intelligence assets should not be placed in Britain anymore if the British continue to go down the route of the Huawei arrangement as agreed by the cabinet last year. Do you think that Britain could, despite the rising tensions at the moment, keep its position about Huawei and its investment in 5G infrastructure, or do you think we'll have to make a choice? Raf, why don't you start on this one, and then I'll pass to your colleagues.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Nice easy question straight over to me. I think I'd look. I think that there's a lot of politics going on here. I mean, I was in London until late last year, and I sat through many presentation from American colleagues coming over, telling me how terrible Huawei was, and how the United Kingdom, as though I had some role in helping facilitate that decision, was making the wrong choice in one direction or another. The point I would make is, the UK did not come to the decision that it came to just out of thin air. This was a decision that was come to by our security services, who theoretically have thought about this quite a great deal, in part because they're at the front line of managing this problem. They're also the ones with the closest relationships and links in the United States. Our security services are deeply intertwined and have been for many, many years. So I don't understand why a decision that's emanated on the basis of advice that's come out of that side of the house is causing this sort of issue, which makes me think that this is more actually, in fact, a political issue that is being hashed out in that sort of a way. I think that clearly a decision, an assessment was made. Technical people tell me quite confidently that this is a problem that can be managed. I'm not a technical person, I do not know. I know full well that Huawei, like any Chinese company, has Communist Party cells within it and is controlled by the government in some way. But obviously there is a realization that this is a manageable problem. So, I think that there's an awful lot of politics going on around this. I struggle, frankly, to see that the United States would make active choices that would weaken the United Kingdom's security on the basis of this. Because the United Kingdom and the United States are deeply intertwined in many, many different ways. So I suspect that there's an awful lot of hysteria around this. There has been for some time. I understand a lot of the problems and I understand where the concerns lie, but I also believe that clearly these are sort of manageable issues. And I think as long as they are manageable issues and people who are having to deal with the consequences of these issues think that they're manageable issues, I'm willing to sort of sit down and say, well, okay, I'll listen to that voice.
So in short, you don't think that this is a binary choice for the UK, and you don't think we will be faced with a direct confrontation with a United States that is determined to contain Chinese technological encroachment?
I mean, I know the United States is keen to, block Chinese technological encroachment. I think there are many other ways that they will do it. I think getting the United Kingdom to make a decision one way or the other isn't ultimately going to make that choice. The point I would say is look at what happened after the United Kingdom made that decision. Secretary Pompeo visited London and he very quickly papered things over and tried to move the conversation beyond. So I think we're seeing a discussion here that is clearly being wrapped up in politics over an actual practical consequences.
Steve?
I'll keep it short. I think Huawei is exactly why I make this distinction between what we see in the change in British perception of Chinese conduct and whether there will be a change in policy of HMG. I think there will probably be a much stronger recognition within government that there is a very special relationship between Huawei and China and the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, and perhaps we should be a bit more worried about it. But will it tip the balance and change government policy over Huawei? I think that there's a huge question mark on that. I would be betting that in fact HMG will not change the policy because we will be in such a poor financial economic state at the end of this COVID pandemic, that for the governments to shift another policy that is going to be very costly to the UK is something that I think would be very, very difficult for the government to consider. And otherwise, I would simply endorse what Ralph has said about how I think the relationship between UK and the US would be. Just adding that all that will change once if the US elections result in a new administration. It's very hard for us to believe that a Biden administration will punish UK on something like that.
But you do accept that Huawei, in a way, is a manifestation of what will increasingly be our predicament in Europe, which is that we will have to make choices between our alliance with the United States and our trade relationship with China, or do you think this is a one-off?
Well, I think we are with a government which is always, at the moment, always trying to have the cake and eat it, and try to avoid coming to a clear choice between the two. I think we're dealing with a government that will push that decision as far back as possible. And therefore, it will not simply do so unless that pressure is immediate and irresistible.
Understood. Vale?
I mean, I think the only thing I'd add to that is, aside from the fact that there is pressure from the United States, and I agree with Raf that I don't necessarily think that that the United Kingdom will really be disconnected from its relationship with the United States so severely as is currently being or has been hinted so far by the US. I do think, though, that there's an additional element of pressure which could come from Westminster. So this debate is really taken a very sharp tone within the Houses of Parliament. And I think if any pressure were going to sway the government or force the government to take an amended position on Huawei, it might be that. So that is something I think we need to keep in mind, and we need to keep an eye on to understand what the government's ultimate decision will be. But I would say that, for as much as I think the Trump administration takes a particularly harsh approach to dealing with its current alliance system on various occasions, there is still a bipartisan agreement within DC on China, and that includes, one would imagine, on Huawei. So whilst the pressure coming from the United States on Huawei might not be the same under a democratic government, should that come into play post-November, I don't think the messages will necessarily change vis-a-vis China itself.
Excellent. Let me turn the question the other way around, namely, what can Britain do, or Britain and a number of European countries can do about the looming sort of and the sharpening confrontation between the United States and China? Namely, is there a role for us to play there? And I have a question from Dr. Frank Hoffman, a distinguished fellow of RUSI and an American defense analyst, who's asking whether the current, what he terms the mutually assured distraction between the United States and China at the moment, whether the UK could be the voice of reason, a rather familiar theme in UK foreign policy, the voice of reason between the United States and China. And we have a question from Mike Maiden, a senior British defense analyst, who's asking indirectly the same thing, which is, are the Chinese missing some opportunities? For instance, if they attended the investment conference on COVID-19, they would have been able to show themselves as the responsible stakeholders that we want them to be. Didn't they miss a trick by not taking part in the recent investment conference? And therefore, didn't they, in a way, shoot themselves in the foot on this question? Who would like to start? Let me start this time, perhaps with Verli, with a few words.
I mean, in terms of have the Chinese missed a trick and have they shot themselves in the foot? I mean, from an outsider's perspective, yes. From an insider's perspective in China, again, the priority is on the domestic situation and on shoring up support for the CCP and ensuring domestic stability. So as much as, we would like China to behave in a certain way, it is not going to do so because its priorities are not where we think its priorities should be necessarily. And so the way it acts is not how we would necessarily act in that given scenario. But yes, I do think there is a point to make that that as China, positions itself as a responsible global stakeholder, one which shoulders an immense burden with its growing power to take part in global goods, it should actively be participating at high levels or at the level that other countries are engaging to find global solutions, find ways of engagement, and really look forward towards ways in we can cooperate to find solutions out of this current crisis. But again, so much is being driven from that domestic situation. We will see if this evolves over time. I mean, it might get to the point that it is so counterproductive that we see slight shifts in how China is approaching its foreign partners to see how it can engage. But for now, as I said in my presentation, I do think that this current approach that they've taken is going to last at least a little bit longer, given that it will have had the approval of top leadership until now. In terms of mutually assured distraction, I really like this term. I think China has obviously called for an end to the blame game as a way to find a way out of this situation. The United States has said that the way out of this situation is an inquiry and an international investigation into where the virus originated. So it's difficult to see how they are going to find a joined up solution on at least bringing the tone down. I think the UK can be a voice of reason. The thing is, as I said, depending on how things develop vis-a-vis, say, Hong Kong, it depends. The UK's relationship with China will be impacted by this. So again, the position that the UK can take is one that urges for calm, for engagement and cooperation. But depending on how things evolve within China, or with regards to its relationship with the United States, this will not be as easy. It'll be easier said than done.
Excellent. Raab?
Very briefly, because I know we're running out of time. I think, could the UK be a voice of reason? As a person who's worked at, the world's oldest British think tank, I would like to hope so. However, I think that we've seen something very depressing happening, which is both sides are basically doubling down at the moment. So whenever confrontations happen, they'll appeal to the worst in that. And so I think it's very difficult. I think if the UK does want to strike a balance and be that voice of reason in between, the trick will be to try to develop an alliance of kind of middle powers. It's something that we've seen discussed a lot over the past year. This idea of building alliance with countries like Japan, Germany, France, powers of great heft in international relations, who are very important. If we could all get together, then we might be able to steer it, while these two frankly shout at each other in this irrational way. I think the Chinese have shown a remarkable ability to shoot themselves in the feet. Just recently, there was this opinion editorial that the EU ambassadors in Brussels decided to publish together, which was published in China Daily. It was a very bland piece, which basically said, the EU and China need to be partners. Now we're at our 45th anniversary. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs insisted on cutting a single line out of it, and insisted on not publishing it in Chinese at the same time. I mean, this was a sort of a home goal that frankly they scored themselves. So, I think it's unfortunate that they have managed to do that. It's unfortunate, by the way, we've seen similar things in the United States. I would briefly add that I do not think actually we're going to see any change under Democrats. As Veerles pointed out, I think that the Dems are just as hard on China, frankly, as the Republicans these days. I would argue if we were to see a change in government or administration in the United States, China would have an even bigger problem, because then you'd have a government in power that could actually marshal an international alliance. At the moment, the Trump administration's wild oscillations, the disagreements between the leader and his administration mean that it's quite difficult, and it's very difficult for any ally to really go along with them, because we don't know what they're really going to do. So I think that, frankly, if the Dems came in, the Chinese would have an even bigger problem on their hands. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raab. For the last few minutes, or last few seconds, as it were, that remain to us, I wonder if I could ask directly a question to Steve about Hong Kong. You said in passing that you see a sort of perhaps a worsening situation in Hong Kong. What do you have in mind? I know you spend a lifetime analyzing Hong Kong. What do you think the central government is likely to do?
I think we are going to see the Chinese government through its liaison office in Hong Kong, requiring the special administrative region governments to introduce national security legislations under Article 23 of the Basic Law of Hong Kong. This is the law about treason and secession and subversion in Hong Kong, and that is going to cause a huge pushback in Hong Kong. And with that pushback and demonstrations, the September Legislative Council or parliamentary elections will seriously be at risk of being cancelled, because in fact the Chinese government expect the pro-government forces to lose the election, and therefore they may well cancel that, and Hong Kong will get into a period of much more protests and more escalated use of force by the Chinese security forces. And if the Hong Kong police cannot do the job, I think the risk of security forces from across the border being deployed to support the garrisons already in Hong Kong is a serious risk in the next 12 months.
And you envisage that Britain could continue talking about a trade deal in complete abstraction to what could be a terribly worsening situation in Hong Kong?
Well, I think the government here will try to avoid that scenario. And the reality is that the Chinese government will not listen very much to what London has to say, and will basically force London to choose. You stand up for your principle over Hong Kong, or you keep your businesses, including vital British companies in Hong Kong and China, and whether they could allow to continue to exist, or just face what happens to those similar British companies in China after 1949. They were all very welcome to become Chinese assets.
Thank you for that, and thank you for finishing on a sobering note. So we have, on the one hand, some encouraging messages in the sense that there is a desire to forge in a relationship with China. There is, as Verli suggested, also a desire to scale down some of the temperature of the heated debate that is going on at the moment. There are some interests on both sides, and I think Raf reminded us that there is a constancy to the American position which will continue, which will act as a point of reference for what the UK does. But as Steve pointed out, we are hitting the buffers, and this is a relationship that could improve, but it's also a relationship that could hit the buffers in a fairly fundamental way if certain events go in the wrong direction in the next year or so. I must apologize to a lot of our listeners who were not able to have their questions put. I know you've been a very spirited audience. This is what I expected for a subject like this. I hope you will stay with us for future broadcasts of the same Mapping the Pandemic series that looks at events around the world as they change as a result of the health emergency. But all it remains for me is to thank Verli, Raf, and Steve for wonderful presentations, and to thank you all, the audience, for being such a spirited one. Goodbye from London.